in many ways, in the big cities of the world, it feels in many ways that we're in a post-religious sort of a society. I say that with an asterisk because it is true that you do see religiosity starting to rise again in young people. And you see that in America, you see that in Europe, you see that in unexpected places, certainly in the global south, in Latin America, in Africa. And yet, for many in the educated, polite sort of elite, there's a sense that religion is this quaint thing that we used to believe when we were cavemen, or when we, didn't know about gravity and we didn't know that the earth revolved around the sun. But now we know better now. We're past it, and that's sort of the promise of socialism, the opiate of the masses. Religion is not a thing that is going to be with us in the future. It's a vestige of our animalistic primordial past. But I think what Kim Il-sung really shows and really captured and really understood is that faith is really important. It's really central, whether or not you call yourself a Christian or a Buddhist or a Muslim or whatever, or an atheist or an agnostic. You believe something, whether you acknowledge it or not, and whether you can articulate it or not. And to me, I think faith is the most powerful thing in many ways, because we know, all of us know, that fame and sex and power and money can motivate people and lead people to do incredible things, whether they're incredibly good or incredibly bad. These are real motivators, but faith taps into something even deeper. It subsumes all of them in a certain sense, because it almost talks about life after death. It talks about things that are bigger than, it talks about transcendence. And I think Kim Il-sung recognized that if you're able to understand and tap into those beliefs that people have, and if you're able to create something that they can believe in, you can make people do almost anything. And you see that in cult movements around the world until the spell breaks. The difference is that North Korea, and I would not necessarily call it a cult, but I would call it a religious society, because I do think it's a society that is oriented around effectively the worship of the Kim family, in ritual and in word and in deed. And so he was able to create something that I think is just, when we look at North Korea, many people will look at it and ridicule it, and look at the Kims and look at their fashion and look at the ridiculousness of the cult. But there's a lot of seriousness there, and there's a reason why it's the DPRK that's still standing in 2026, arguably stronger than almost any other country of its peers. You look at Cuba, you look at the USSR, you look at East Germany, you look at Vietnam, you look at China even. I mean, I'm not going to say DPRK is stronger than China, but certainly China's changed quite a bit since the Cultural Revolution years, for example. But the DPRK and Kim Il-sung found something enduring here. And in a way, he found his own immortality. And I don't want to say that that's necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, but we're still talking about him. His statues still stand. He is still the eternal president. His country, his family is still leading this nation of 25 million people. And it all comes back, I think, to an understanding of the power of faith. And I don't think anyone understood it perhaps better than Kim Il-sung did. And I think that's why we are where we are, why the Korean Peninsula is the way that it is today. He's the most consequential figure in 20th century Korean history. And I don't know that enough has been done to understand not only him, but his Christian upbringing and how that flowed into the nation state that we see today.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Korea Deconstructed. Today, I'm joined by Jonathan Cheng, the China bureau chief for the Wall Street Journal. Jonathan speaks English, Cantonese, Mandarin Chinese, French, and Korean. He's a native of Toronto, Canada, a graduate from Princeton University with a degree in history. He lives in Beijing now and has traveled to North Korea twice. Very grateful to welcome him today, Jonathan. It's wonderful to see you. Thank you for being here.
It's great to be here.
We're going to talk about Jonathan's fantastic book that I've been reading through this past week. It's called Korean Messiah, Kim Il-sung and the Christian Roots of North Korea's Personality Cult. And you see the title, you see the front cover, you imagine this is going to be a lot about North Korean politics. And I was pleasantly surprised, Jonathan, because this is a book about the arrival of Christianity onto the Korean peninsula, and then how that interacted with native belief systems, nationalism, Japanese pro and anti-sentiment, communism, all of this. It's brilliant exploration of those. And so can we start perhaps, Jonathan, with you painting a picture of the Joseon Dynasty, the latter stages of that, into which Christian ministries arrived?
Sure, yes. First of all, I'm really, really glad that you are starting with the beginning of the book, because you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
The book is called Korean Messiah, and a spoiler alert, the Korean Messiah I'm referring to here is Kim Il-sung. So the book is about Kim Il-sung. There's no mistaking that. But I think what I wanted to show is that Kim Il-sung didn't come out of nowhere. He didn't come out of a vacuum. He came out of a milieu, of course. We all come out of our own milieu, whatever that may be. And for Kim Il-sung, he came out of Korea, obviously, and northwestern Korea. And so I really needed to sort of situate him there so that we understand where he came from and where the North Korean state that we're still thinking about, talking about every single day right now, where that came from. And you're absolutely right. This is a book that really does get into the history of Christianity on the Korean peninsula. In fact, 2/3 of my book take place before 1945. So this is even before North Korea even is a concept in anyone's imagination at this point. So yes, that's really what I wanted to do. And so you have to start with the Joseon Dynasty. And the Joseon Dynasty, as Korea listeners will know, was the last feudal dynasty in Korean history. It lasted for more than 500 years. That's a really, really long time for any dynasty. And by the time the first Christian missionaries arrived in Korea, it was the 1880s. It was pretty long in the tooth at that point. If you're looking and thinking in terms of, let's say, Chinese dynastic cycles, 500 years, that's very long in the tooth. And so, as you might imagine, it was a dynasty that was a little bit ragged. It was not at its peak. And it was, as the well-known moniker goes, it was a hermit kingdom to a large degree. Obviously, there's a lot of nuance there, and it wasn't as shut off from the rest of the world, perhaps, as some people might imagine it to be. But there's no question that, in the main, it really was quite a hermit kingdom. And so, into this sort of environment, you had all sorts of new ideas come with Western, not just missionaries, but also with Western trade, with gunboats, with all the rest of it. And so you really have to think about North Korea coming out of that sort of environment.
What I found very interesting, Jonathan, is that a lot of people who watch Korean historical dramas and movies, it's kind of a rosy picture that's often painted of the Joseon Dynasty, because nation building and patriotism, and I completely understand it, and beautiful actors and idols in hanboks is, what a lot of people want to see. But what you do in your descriptions is you talk of a rather sort of, you described it as ragged just then, but a dark and oppressive time, women often not given names, and sort of this feudalism that extends into slavery. Can you perhaps just maybe expand on that a little bit, and why the sort of Christianity did appeal to so many people? Because it was a reaction against that, wasn't it?
That's exactly right. And, I really tell the story of Joseon Dynasty Korea through the eyes of the first Western missionaries that get there. Now, that's a choice, and I own that choice. So you're really coming in with Western eyes. I mean, this book is written by somebody who I would consider myself to have a Western perspective. That's just the fact of who I am. My background is Hong Kong Chinese. I was born and raised in Canada, but effectively I do have a Western outlook on the world, and there's no denying or sugarcoating that. And so in many ways, I looked and I saw a lot of familiarity in how the Western missionaries first encountered Korea and what they saw. And so, of course, you can talk about cultural relativism quite a lot and everything else, but I think by a lot of standards, you're right, exactly what you said. Korea in the late Joseon period was not necessarily a great place. It depended on who you were. If you were obviously at the top of the pyramid, you were doing just fine. But if you were one half of the population, that was a woman, female, life wasn't very good at all. And you point out exactly one of the things that most struck all the missionaries when they first got there. Women didn't have names in most cases, many cases, almost all cases. They were called daughter of so-and-so, or they'd be called second daughter, or they'd be called the loud one or the quiet one or the one with rosy cheeks or something like that, because they didn't give names to their daughters. They gave names to their sons. And to the missionaries, when they first got there, they couldn't believe it. And keep in mind, missionaries had been to India by that point. They had been to China by that point. They'd been to Japan by that point for many, many years, decades, in fact, more than a century in some cases by the time the first missionaries got to Korea. And many of them made that comparison to India and the caste system there. And they said, it might be worse in Korea even than in India. And so they saw these sorts of things. And of course, looking through the Christian missionary lens, looking through the lens of the faith that they were bringing to the peninsula, they of course saw it as a sign of a moral failing. They saw it as a sign of a lack of God's presence, a lack of God's favor. That was the lens that they looked at it through. But I don't think you need to look at it through that lens necessarily to sort of see where they were coming from and what they saw. And indeed, many Koreans who became Christian and many modern Koreans looking back on that time, if you're objective, you'll say, it probably better to be living now than it was back then. And not just because we have the internet and all the rest, but just the social fabric and the social everything about it was just a lot more oppressive than, as you say, the K-dramas will show you.
It was really oppressive. And I think that's why that historical perspective is important, because yes, Korea still might be not perfect in its gender equality and these kind of things, still a lot of work to do. But when you consider where it's come from in a short period of time, 140 years is, 2 lifetimes, 2 generations, it's come an incredibly long way. When you paint the picture of this late Joseon Dynasty, Jonathan, you also talk about Kija and the tomb of Kija, which is located in the north of the peninsula. And I've tried to talk to Korean people about Kija, and they look at me and they say, journalist, as if it doesn't really, because that's also the Korean word for journalist, yeah. But it doesn't really resonate with them. And here we have in Korea, Gaechonjol as a national holiday, the foundation day, where they sort of celebrate Dangun, the founder. But Kija has kind of been erased from the consciousness of South Korean everyday life. But at that time, Kija was a very important figure, and you talk a lot, and there's photos of the tombs. And can you say something about Kija as you understand him, please, Jonathan?
Sure. So Kija, to put it very bluntly, was Chinese, and that is part of why he has been erased or sidelined from modern Korean historiography. And you say South Korea, but it's also North Korea as well. I don't think either Korea really wants to talk about this founding father, this mythological figure who was actually Chinese. So the story goes that he was a Chinese nobleman. He was related to and serving a despotic Chinese emperor. And when the time came, he decided not to stay in China, but rather to go to Korea, to go to the Korean peninsula, and to basically civilize the Koreans. That was a historiography, and not just in China. That was a historiography in Korea as well, because as we all know, Confucianism has had a very strong presence in Korean history and Korean thinking and Korean society. That's not disputed. And of course, Confucius was Chinese. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about any of that. And so it's a part and parcel of that, because you could really see the sidelining of Kija happen really at the dawn of the 20th century, where you really start to see a new kind of Korean nationalism emerge. And a lot of scholars have written about this, and I drew upon a lot of their work. It's excellent scholarship that's out there. But it's also just really, really clear that this Tangun myth was a much better one, because it backdated things even further than Kija. So you go even further back into the past, which is always great for any civilization. You want to show that you were there at the very beginning. But also it erased this reliance on China as a source of legitimacy. And that's, again, completely understandable when you're a nation that is under siege effectively from Japan at that point, skipping ahead a little bit in the history, of course. But when Koreans were feeling put upon by the Japanese, feeling like their culture was being erased, it was only natural that when they searched for their origins, that they don't want to go back to the Chinese noblemen who came over to Korea and civilized Korea, quote unquote, but rather, it was from Mount Paektu all the way down here, and it was direct from the heavens, and that's where the Korean people came from. And of course, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, it doesn't, perhaps at the time, at the start of the 20th century, with sort of the collapse of the Qing dynasty in China, it made also sense to find different people. We normally think of Christianity as a rather conservative belief. Certainly today in modern South Korea, Christianity is seen as something that maybe stands in the way of some social progress in terms of human rights towards different sexual identities and things like that. But you know, what's really interesting is that at the end of the 1900s, Christianity was progressive and radical here. It would have been seen as this new sort of very dangerous thing. Can you say something about how Christian beliefs coming into the country would have been really challenging the status quo for a lot of the Korean peninsula, please?
Yes, definitely. You've got it exactly right. Obviously, the Joseon Dynasty, as we described, was quite calcified in its social strata. It was not a sort of place where you could pull yourself up by the bootstraps, where you could change your fate. Education was really just confined to the Confucian classics. And if you were a yangban, you know, an aristocrat, your path was probably much smoother than it was if you were not. And that was that. And Christianity is interesting because it's not just in Korea, in so many contexts and historical moments in history, you really do see Christianity seized upon as a ticket to social advancement, because the notional idea that we are all equal before God, that we can, through a Protestant work ethic, raise our own social status and stature, that's all something that is music to the ears of people who don't feel like they have a chance otherwise. And what's so interesting, and actually to take it back to Kija a little bit, I mean, the center of the Kija cult and the Kija tomb was, as you note, in Pyongyang. And Pyongyang, in the northwest of China, was the most socially marginalized group of Koreans. We know that the Korean peninsula is not that big when you look at a map of the world, and yet we also know that social divisions, even within South Korea today, are extremely contentious. Whether you're talking about Chollado or you're talking about Gyeongsang-do or whatever the case may be, it's very much a regionalism is very strong. And back then it was even stronger, and it was really strong against those from the Northwest. So the Northwesterners were the ones who, in their minds, studied the hardest and should have been given access to the levers of power through the civil service examination. Many of them were excluded that way. Instead, what happened in the Northwest, you had a lot of people saying, well, if I can't get into the system that way, then I'm going to use my wits, I'm going to use my hard work, and I'm going to smuggle, and I'm going to trade, and I'm going to find other ways to make my way. And that's where Christianity really took hold. It came over the border from northeastern China, from Manchuria, from Scottish missionaries that were there. That was really where the Protestant Christian message first came over. And I should just quickly note, too, that Catholicism also has a very rich history in Korea. I'm primarily focused on Protestantism here. So when I talk about Christianity, I'm mostly talking about Protestantism here. But you really have the Northwesterners so much more receptive to the message, because they were the ones who were the ones excluded from power. They were the ones who were more dynamic in their thinking, more open to new ideas, and they were living on the margins, and they were pulling themselves up by the bootstraps. And I think that that is why, when the message first came over, that's really where it took hold.
Because in the Joseon Dynasty, the center of power would have been in Seoul rather in the north where it was previously. So that makes sense. And this is also jumping ahead a little bit, but you said something later on in your book where you say that contrary to how we see it today, sort of in the start of the 20th century, 1900s, most of the Christians were in the north and most of the communists were in the south. And I sort of underlined that sentence and thought, wow, it's amazing how a few decades can change all of that. So we get perhaps coming to this idea, Jonathan, of the Jerusalem of the East, which some people might have heard of, but then the Pyongyang Revival, which is a fascinating thing because you spend a little bit of time talking about this Pyongyang Revival. Can you say sort of maybe how Christianity comes in from Manchuria, it goes there, but then the effect that it has on that part of the land?
Sure. And actually, to get to the 1907 revival, we really need to talk about a man named Samuel Moffett.
Yes.
And Samuel Moffett is from Indiana. He was born in 1864 during the Civil War. He went to a school called Hanover College, which incidentally is exactly the same school that the vice president of the US, Mike Pence, went to 97 years later. They were both members of the same fraternity, and both of them were very similar in their dispositions. They were both very, I mean, I've never met Mike Pence, but his persona is one of a very serious, sort of held together, very conservative Christian. And that's precisely what Samuel Moffett was. And he was one of these young men who grew up in the idealism of post-Civil War America, who felt like the sky was the limit. America had rolled across the landmass and had electricity and steamships, and they were united again. And he wanted, like so many other young men of that time, he wanted to go and share the gospel of Christ in the farthest corners of the world, to the cannibals of Polynesia, to the deepest, darkest parts of Africa. That was their language that they used to talk about this, to share the gospel with the heathen. That's what they would have said. And obviously, that word heathen is a pretty loaded term today. I don't think anyone uses it without a dash of irony, but he used it very seriously. And that was the time that he was coming out of. That was his period. And so Samuel Moffett arrives in Korea on his 26th birthday in 1890. So that's how old he is. He's 26. He's 25 when he leaves America. He's 26 on the day he arrives at Incheon. And he makes his way to Seoul, of course. But then they send him up as a 26-year-old to be the first one to open up Pyongyang. And you have to keep in mind that Seoul, at that point, by the time he arrives in 1890, there have been Protestant missionaries living in Seoul for 6 years at that point. And they're somewhat successful in spreading their message. Certainly as white men and women, they get a lot of attention. There's no question about that. But whether or not the attention was on the way they looked or what they were teaching is a different matter. So there was some interest in what they were teaching in Seoul, but not too much. They sent one of their missionaries down to Busan. And when they got to Busan, they found it even more unreceptive. It took them 3 years before they baptized their first convert. 3 years of labor and toil. Then you have Samuel Moffett. He goes up to Pyongyang, and before long, he finds that he can barely have any time to even eat or to sleep, because he effectively has a queue out his door of all these inquirers who want to say, what is it that you're teaching? Because we want to learn more about this Jesus Christ that you're talking about. We don't know anything about him. Tell us about him. What is this message? And so you have this really strong start. Now, I oversimplified a little bit. You have to read the book to get into all the details. There was the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95. Pyongyang is destroyed in this battle, utterly destroyed, flattened during this war, during this battle. And after that, in 1895, this is really where you see the roots of the Jerusalem of the East come together. And it's all really under Samuel Moffett, because he was the first guy to get there. And he was a dynamic and just a really savvy guy. He was very conservative, but he was also bringing a radical message that was utterly unheard of when he arrived there to the Pyongyang population. They hadn't heard anything like this message before, and I think it really appealed to them. And so you see him start to build one church, and it gets so full they need to build another one. And that church gets so full, and they need to build another one, and so on and so on and so on, to the point where Pyongyang becomes filled with these churches, and not just churches, but also they start schools, they start hospitals, they start schools for the blind, for the deaf, they start orphanages, they start hospitals, they start leprosy wards, they start all sorts of these institutions. They have a seminary, they have a high school for missionary children, and that's where Billy Graham's wife went to high school in the 30s. You have this whole universe that gets created in Pyongyang, which is what we refer to when we say the Jerusalem of the East. And Samuel Moffett was a Presbyterian, which is, of course, one branch of Protestant Christianity. Methodists were also a big part of this as well, and Peije Academy in Seoul, for example, and many of the biggest institutions were Methodist as well. So you have the Presbyterians and the Methodists just built up this incredible center of Christendom in Pyongyang. And 1907 is an interesting period, because to go back to the political frame, what's happening in 1907? By 1907, Korea had lost its sovereignty. It had become a protectorate of the Japanese Empire. And a protectorate was a face-saving way, a fig leaf, as it were, for Korea still remaining a viable sort of independent country. But really what it was it was a half step to what happened in 1910, which, as the more historically minded listeners will know, was when Korea was formally annexed by Japan. So 1907, you become a protectorate, and they may not know it yet, but I think most of them know that it's just a way station to annexation. And there was a real sense of national crisis among the Koreans. They felt like we have been one nation since time immemorial, and we've been on our own. And if you look at a map of the Asian mainland, and you look at China growing and shrinking over the various dynasties and incorporating this land and losing that land and splitting up and rejoining again, you'll see that Korea just always stays over there in the top right corner. And yes, the northern boundary does move from time to time, but for the most part, we know it really has been a united country for a kingdom for all these millennia. And it has a language and a culture and costume and food and dress and everything else that is just distinct. It's utterly distinct from the rest of China, and it's remained that way. And to have that loss, this is, I think, really where this revival needs to be situated in. And a revival, for those who may not know, is I suppose there are many different ways to describe it. And of course, revivals have taken place in many different countries, but it's a mass sort of a movement, a mass outpouring, I think you could say. In Christian terms, it would be a mass outpouring of the Holy Spirit, right? In secular terms, or in more sociological terms, you might say a mass outpouring of emotion, or a mass outpouring of human connection, almost, you could say. If you want to be more pejorative about it, you could call it a mass hysteria. But you put that all together, and you get the picture of what I'm describing here, because in January of 1907, you have the missionaries who are leading the Korean church trying to start a revival. They're trying to get a revival. They feel like some of their believers have gotten cold, or they've lost their passion in some way. They don't actually do all that much other than to have these evening prayer meetings. And so they would get together, and it was on a Monday evening that the first sort of moment took place. And by the end of the evening, there was weeping, wailing. People were pounding their chests. They're slamming their heads on the floor. They're coming forward. They're confessing their sins and their crimes. You had one missionary, even an American missionary, who confessed to adultery. And so he had to leave the mission right then and there. You had a lot of Koreans who confessed to murder. They murdered their younger brother. They murdered their enemy. They murdered their rival. And the anguish and the pain that they felt, I don't question the reality of it. You read the accounts, and you know that the missionaries were trying to start a revival, but actually these missionaries were very buttoned-up guys. Samuel Moffett, all of his peers, they were, if you think of Sunday best, you think of hard wooden pews and stained glass windows. This was the sort of milieu that these guys are coming out of. They didn't want weeping and wailing, pounding of fists on the floor, people slamming their heads on the pulpit. That's not what they were looking for, but that's what they got. And you can look at it however you like, but it was a mass catharsis, I guess you could say. But it was really sort of the pinnacle of this solidification of Pyongyang as the unquestioned capital of Christianity in Korea, but not just in Korea, all over Asia, because you had missionaries from China flowing over. They were all coming to Pyongyang and saying, what is going on here? We need to see this. And even missionaries were coming over from America. Pastors, church leaders were coming over from America because they wanted to see, what is this that's happening here? And what's interesting too, and this is my final point, I've given you a long answer here, but 1907, you also have to realize, is 5 years before the birth of Kim Il-sung in that very same city, Pyongyang. So that is the milieu in which Kim Il-sung, the Korean Messiah, was born.
I love the long answers, Jonathan, and in a very fatuous way, it reminds me of the Simpson memes, where when the meteor and the end of days is coming, everybody runs out of the pub into the church, and everybody in the church runs out of the church and into the pub. Because, it must have been such an existential crisis in 1907. People fearing like the Japan had also beaten Russia by that time in the Russo-Japanese War. You mentioned the Japanese-Chinese War, 1894 and 1895. I think sometimes people also forget that took place on the Korean Peninsula, that this was a battlefield for much of East Asia, of all these powers. You mentioned Mr. Moffett there, Samuel Moffett, a little bit, as coming over as this young man, and I remember you describing in your book, like, he couldn't even sleep at night because people were poking holes in the paper, looking at him, and no privacy. Perhaps can you say something about the characters of this time, whether they're the Americans, whether it's a little bit more on Samuel Moffett coming over, because it must have been so incredibly different then and so incredibly challenging. And it wasn't just him, there were many others, but there were also Korean preachers and pastors by that time. You forgive me, the name escapes me now, but the blind one, the half-blind one. Can you say something a little bit more about the figures in this church, please, Jonathan?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. I mean, Samuel Moffett was the unquestioned leader of the Pyongyang Presbyterians. They jokingly called him the Archbishop of Pyongyang, jokingly because the Presbyterian Church doesn't have archbishops, but that was sort of the stature that he held. Almost like a papal like figure that he was, but he was also described as just very kind and very high in EQ, I think, to use a modern term. I mean, that comes across so clearly in his letters, in the letters that others wrote about him, both Korean and fellow missionary. And he was the right man at the right time. There's no question about that. But he's largely forgotten, of course, because Pyongyang is not where the church remained. And so his rival may be too strong of a word, but Horace Underwood is the one who gets most of the credit in Seoul, of course, because he's affiliated with Yonsei University, which he founded, and with the Severance Hospital, which of course is also part of the Yonsei complex there. But I don't want to say rival too, I don't want to lean into that too much, but they did have competing philosophies about how to conduct missions work. And Samuel Moffett was one of these guys who just said, it is all about salvation. That is it. We can start schools, we can start hospitals, and these are all well and good. I'm all for healing people, I'm all for educating people, but none of that matters because it's just a means to an end of getting them saved, because it's their souls that we're worried about. It's not their bodies here and now. And Underwood would have taken a different view, and he would have said, yes, we want to save souls. We definitely do. But we also have a mission to educate. We have a mission to heal. We have a mission to make this world better as well. So you see this philosophical clash. And you had Underwood in Seoul. You had Moffett in Pyongyang. But Underwood is the one that's more remembered today, and I understand why. But you have Moffett representing not only that philosophy of missions work, but just in his social views. He was conservative. He was of that ilk that really didn't clap hands, didn't play cards, didn't go to the races, thought dancing was evil, forget about cigarettes, forget about alcohol, forget about any of this. I mean, he was as straight of an arrow as one could imagine. Not to say Underwood was not. I mean, as a whole, these were pretty pious Presbyterians and Methodists that were coming over here to Korea. They were also incredible note takers, letter writers, and that's why I'm able to reconstruct this world, because the records were just so meticulous. And you're right, they worked a lot with the Koreans. And, Samuel Moffett was quite foresighted in this way. There's two schools of thought on exactly how he played this. But the evidence that I have found suggests that he was actually very much in tune with this idea that a missionary really should not be trying to bring his culture over. I'm bringing over my gospel message of Jesus Christ. But other than that, it ought to be a Korean church. And my job as a missionary is to plant it and then get out, or hand it over to you guys. And so you do see a lot of that. Now, like I said, there are two schools of thought, and there are people who will point to the more traditionally imperialistic sort of view of Moffett and of the missionaries more generally, that no, actually they wanted to stay in control. I don't really buy that, but I lay the evidence out there in the book. You can feel free to read that more carefully if you like. What is certain is that you have Samuel Moffett developing very close relationships with a lot of the Korean church leaders, and Kil Sunju is the blind preacher that you mentioned. He wasn't fully medically blind, but he was so impaired in his sight that he did need people to sort of guide him around and lead him up to the pulpit and do all this other stuff. And of course, that also had this real sort of mystical air to him because he couldn't see with his eyes, and yet he could see. He had vision. He had a different kind of vision, right? I think that was sort of the idea. And he spoke prophetically, and he especially in his later days, he did become quite mystical. He preached from the book of Revelation about the apocalypse and about the end of the world and all this other stuff. And we're going on into the hereafter. Forget about the world here. But don't forget, too, that he was one of the 33 signers of the March 1st Declaration of Independence. And this is, again, skipping ahead a little bit, but that is, of course, the document that crystallizes and encapsulates the spirit of Korean nationalism, period. Throughout the entire 20th century, that is the document. There were 33 signers, and he was one of them. So he wasn't detached from this world. He was very much connected with the Korean nationalist cause as well, but he fused them all together. He was, by all measures, unfortunately, of course, in that time, we don't have recordings of his sermons, but the missionaries were astounded by his ability to preach, his ability to connect with a congregation and to inspire them and to move them and to compel them to give their lives to Christ or to give their lives to the Korean cause, both. And so you have this great sort of incubator in Pyongyang of not just Christianity, but also of nationalism. And again, I fear that that's forgotten a lot because Pyongyang, of course, is now just synonymous with one thing, which is Kim Il-sung Square and and all the rest of the statues, Mansure, all of that. And that's as it should be because that's real too. But before that Pyongyang, there was the Jerusalem of the East Pyongyang. And that was very real as well.
And that's, I think, we come to next, where Kim Il-sung's parents would have grown up and been attending church and all of these things. Just as you was describing that, Jonathan, two things came to my mind that I remember reading but didn't put into the notes. One was the book of Revelation that was kind of going around Korea at the time that was said to be a forgery. And the other one was the
Jeonggamnok.
Thank you. And the other one was this is going much later in time, the gentleman that Kim Il-sung met, whose name was sort of like Cholimar or 10,000 miles. Right. Can you, I know they're two very different things, but this is sort of playing into that idea of spirituality and belief and all of these ideas that I don't think get talked about very much. Those two things, maybe the book or that figure, if you have anything to say about them.
I've got a lot to say about it. How much time do you have? It's really the question. But
keep going.
But syncretism is the word that you usually use. It's the scholarly word that is just the mashing together of different belief systems and religions and ideas and so on. And part of the real underlying premise of my book here is that Christianity is not the one thing that explains North Korea. I would never assert that because it's just not true. What I would say, of course, is that Korea, like every other country, every other place in the world, has got a stew of influences. Shamanism is certainly one of them. Confucianism is certainly one of them. And the ideas that the Japanese brought in. Brian Myers, of course, Dan and Busan has been arguing that for many years. But also Stalinism and socialism. And certainly there's no denying that had a big ideological impact on what certainly evolved in North Korea. But Christianity came into this. Now, of course, there was no Stalinism by then or socialism by then. There was no Japanese imperial worship necessarily in the Korean peninsula then. But you did have a lot of shamanism and you did have Confucianism. And so you have these prophecies. And when a text like the Bible with the book of Revelation and all of its imagery comes into Korea, and many Koreans focused on that, like with the beasts and the virgins and all the weird sort of imagery, I think they really locked into that, in part because there was a tradition of that, of course, within Korea's own native shamanism, Confucianism, and even Taoism and Buddhism, and all of these influences that were a part of Korean spirituality at that time. So you mentioned first the Jeonggamnok, which was this prophetic book that claimed that the Joseon Dynasty would be replaced after 500 years by a new dynasty, by a true man, a Jin-in. Jin-in, like 진짜 Jin, right? But in as a person, Jin-in. It would come from an island in the sea and would come and throw off the present dynasty and usher in a brand new dynasty. All, this sort of prophetic sort of language. It's not a coincidence that the Joseon Dynasty was hitting its 500th birthday right around then. Now, was that coincidence that whoever wrote the Jeonggamnok probably wrote it that way so that it would match the Joseon Dynasty's, age at that point? But what that did, of course, is it fed into pre-existing concerns there that the dynasty that they were a part of was falling apart, that it was no longer fit for purpose. And so that played a big role. And I think Kim Il-sung in some way was able to tap into this. I don't want to say in any direct way. Even the Christian missionaries were able to tap into this. And Kil Sunju, the blind preacher, was one of these who was able to merge traditional Korean prophetic thinking with Christian prophetic thinking. And then you mentioned Cha Choli was his name. So he was Mr. Cha, but they called him Cha Choli because he could cover 1,000 ri in a day, according to legend. So that would be, I can't think off the top of my head, something like 250 miles, 300, something like that, 300 some kilometers or so in a day on foot. And so he became a legendary figure. And I love this moment in Kim Il-sung's memoir, which, by the way, was a major source for my own book. I think a lot of scholars don't take Kim Il-sung's memoir seriously. I understand why. It is mostly fiction, but that first volume there is just incredibly telling about his upbringing. He talks so much about his own church upbringing and his Christian influences that you have to think that if they were going to write just pure fiction, pure hagiography, that they wouldn't have done that. But that's what they did. And in that first volume, you have this scene where a young Kim Il-sung, by this point, he's a revolutionary. He's in Manchuria, and he meets with this man who can cover 1,000 miles a day, and his legend is sort of gone through the forests of Manchuria. And when he finally gets to meet the guy, he sort of whispers to Kim Il-sung, he says, I can't actually cover that much distance. I never really could. But Kim Il-sung sort of has this moment where he sort of says, I love that he didn't burst the bubble. He let his myth do the work for him in a certain sense. And actually, that's paired with another story that I really love that's in the same section of his memoir where Kim Il-sung is sitting in a room listening to a simple peasant in the next room talking to one of Kim Il-sung's right-hand men. And the peasant says, I hear that Kim Il-sung can walk on water or can dodge bullets or can fly or can do this or that, whatever the fantastic claims would be. And Kim Il-sung's right-hand man keeps telling this peasant, yes, it's true. Yes, it's true. Yes, it's true. And afterwards, Kim Il-sung goes and talks to his right-hand man and says, why did you let that simple peasant believe all of this? And his lieutenant here basically says, if they want to believe it, we have to let them believe it. And Kim Il-sung sort of turns to the reader and sort of says, that's it. I've learned the value of, now I'm using my own words, of course, of play acting as Messiah, because the people needed that. Who am I to burst their bubble, to tell them that Santa Claus doesn't exist, to tell them that Kim Il-sung doesn't exist, to tell them that, Cha Choli doesn't exist? No, we're all here and we're fighting for the Korean nation, right? So I think the question you're talking about here, if we zoom out a little bit, is about the things that we believe, the mystical things, sometimes things that are not always rational, but that even if they're not real, have very real consequences. They create a reality that then becomes manifest and becomes reality.
And promotes people to action and provokes them and inspires them. And I think that's what good leaders from the left or the right do, don't they? They paint a picture. And that was something that you also sort of say that Kim Il-sung would criticize other people for doing by just sort of accepting or praying or not going forward. Because we probably should say something now. I should ask you to say something now, Jonathan, about that first volume. It's 8 volumes, isn't it? The Kim Il-sung memoirs.
That's right.
Congratulations on reading it. But that early life, his parents going to church and then Japanese colonization, because I get, reading your book, I found myself going, go on, get the Japanese out, Kim Il-sung, like return your nation. I felt almost as like I was on his side for moments because of that love of the country, because rather than the party or anything like this, you want people to have your home. And we go on the news today and we want, Palestinian people to have a home and Israeli people. It sings to something in us, at least. And when I was reading that, I was like, yeah, go on, Kim Il-sung, get your home. So his early Christian upbringing, perhaps, in his family and Japanese colonization, that being ripped away.
Yeah. So he is raised in the church. He's a third generation Christian, you could call him. I don't know that I want to call him a Christian. That's up to him. And he certainly doesn't call himself a Christian. But his grandparents were Christian. His parents were quite devout Christian as well. So he was the son and grandson of Christians, I think we can definitely say. Kim Il-sung writes about growing up holding his mother's wrist, following her to church every Sunday. He talks about how much his father influenced him, and his father taught him to play the organ at church. And his father taught him all sorts of lessons, and he doesn't mention Bible lessons, but he actually mentions lessons about George Washington and about, other sort of figures. And unsaid there is this idea that, of course, he inculcated his son, Kim Il-sung, with Christian teachings. That's the milieu that Kim Il-sung grew up in. He taught Sunday school. He went to church with his mother. He learned to play the organ at church. He performed in church plays. He spoke at the YMCA. He lived in the home of a pastor when he was in Manchuria. He was living in a church bubble. And by the way, this is not even stuff I had to uncover. This is stuff that Kim Il-sung writes about in his memoir. This is also stuff that childhood friends of his, some of whom became very close to him at the end of their lives and are buried in North Korea today, they recount all of this as well, just how steeped he was in the church world of Pyongyang in the 1910s. And of course, at the end of the 1910s is the March 1st independence movement. And it happened not just in Seoul, it also happened in Pyongyang. Kim Il-sung was in the city at that time. He was, of course, just 6 years old, but he was a part of it in a sense. I mean, he recounts himself being there at the scene. Now, this is where fiction probably takes over a little bit, but this is a part of his upbringing. And there's no question that his father was not only a devout Christian, but a deeply, deeply committed Korean nationalist as well. The question is really whether or not he ever turned to socialism, as North Korea now says he does. He did. What I found is almost certainly the opposite. It appears that he was actually quite a conservative Christian nationalist. He was not inclined towards socialism. In fact, he was opposed to it. And there were those deep divides there, I mean, we talked about how radical the missionaries were and the ideas and the teachings and the practices that they brought. But actually, by the 1910s and the 1920s, they were already seen as being retrograde in many ways because all of the isms had flowed into Korea, just as they had into China and to any other country. The isms of socialism, of idealism, of Marxism, of feminism, of anarchism. All of these ideas had started to flow into Korea, and now the Christians now didn't seem so cutting edge anymore. They now seemed almost a little bit conservative. Kim Il-sung is growing up in this Christian environment. He's steeped in the nationalism that is not just from his father, but also from all of the people around him. The church was a nationalist body because when the Japanese came and seized Korea, they shut down almost all of civil society. But the one bit of civil society they didn't dare shut down were the churches. And that was because the Japanese craved the approval of the Western world. They wanted to be treated like a peer. We are a global empire. We are enlightened, and we can be partners with you, or we can be rivals with you. We just disposed of Russia. And of course, a few years later, they would take on the US and they would take on the Western world. But at that time, they were really trying to send the message that we are enlightened, and therefore we're not going to shut down your churches because we know how important that is to Western leaders, American presidents and British prime ministers and so on. And so we're going to let these churches stay. And so it became this underground network, almost above ground network of nationalists in Korea and in the growing Korean diaspora in Manchuria and elsewhere. So that's how these two sort of Christianity and nationalism sort of like intertwine, like two bits of ivy, you know? And so you're right. When you're cheering for Kim Il-sung, when you're sort of saying, go on, get rid of those Japanese. I mean, really, a lot of the nationalists at that time actually saw the church as a vehicle for their nationalist aspirations.
Mm. I've heard, with the Japanese allowing the churches to continue perhaps to appease or play up to Western sentiments of their own enlightenment. I've also heard that they allowed Buddhist monks to come back into Seoul, the capital, that sort of for 500 years, the Confucians had said to the Buddhists, get out, put some clothes on and do some work, or out into the countryside. And when the Japanese took over, they sort of said, where's all your monks? What's going on here? And so there was that. You also do talk about the erection of the Shinto shrines and the gates on Namsan. One of the things in terms of this nationalism and Christianity linking, you include a photo of Cho Man-sik, who gets a lot of attention in your book, rightly so. There's a photo of Cho Man-sik, Yo Eun-young, and An Chang-ho taken in 1935. And I just looked at it, and Yo Eun-young is a figure that's always fascinated me. But in your book, Jonathan, Cho Man-sik almost becomes the leader of North Korea. And you almost feel like he should be. That, you describe the meetings between him and Kim Il-sung. Kim Il-sung is now Kim Il-sung. He's deferent and he sort of bows, and Cho Man-sik is the elder. Can you say something about, not the paths that were not taken, but how Kim Il-sung rose above Cho Man-sik to become the person that he became?
Sure. Yeah. So Cho Man-sik, he was known as the Gandhi of Korea. That was his moniker, and that's because he insisted on wearing traditional robes, of course not Indian robes, but Korean robes in this case. And he lived a life of simplicity. He was an advocate for just frugal, simple living. He was also very, very devout Christian. He was a Presbyterian elder in one of the churches in Pyongyang. He was also unquestionable in his nationalist credentials. He was one of the few Koreans who refused to take a Japanese name at a time when many Koreans took Japanese names because, of course, they were coerced to, but also because it did lead to social advancement and open up opportunities that were otherwise unavailable. But Cho Man-sik was pretty stubborn about that. And stubbornness is a big part of his downfall. Stubbornness is a negative word. You could call it his conviction, whatever you want to call it. His conviction, his stubbornness. There's no question that it was very strong in Cho Man-sik. And so he was the unquestioned political figure in Northern Korea. He was the main guy. And when the Soviets rolled down from Manchuria in 1945, and they stopped at the 30th parallel, very famously, of course, they looked around at all the lands north of the 30th parallel, and they sort of said, well, Cho Man-sik is probably our guy. We don't necessarily agree with him ideologically. Really, the ideals that Cho Man-sik espoused were very similar to the ones that the American missionaries would have brought. And he had in mind freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, a democratic electoral sort of system, as well as Christian principles and all the rest of it, right? So that was his vision. That's not the Soviet vision. But his popularity was such that they really felt they had no choice. He was their guy. The problem is, he was too stubborn in his convictions. And so at the end of 1945, of course, this is just months into Soviet-occupied Northern Korea, Cho Man-sik refuses to budge on the issue of trusteeship. And we don't need to get into all that here, but effectively what Cho Man-sik insisted is that Korea must be free and independent right now. No ifs, ands, or buts, no delay. No, don't give me your excuses. We need to be independent now. And the difference is Kim Il-sung, who was, of course, at this point, just 33 years old, he actually has a great opportunity here and he takes it. And of course, Kim Il-sung has now made himself into the epitome, the embodiment of Korean nationalism, of uncompromising Korean nationalism. And in many ways, there's a lot to back up that argument. They did get rid of Chinese troops and of Russian troops really quickly after the Korean War, whereas, of course, USFK is still there today, and so on. I mean, you can point to these sorts of things, and North Korea does. They point to it all the time. And yet, at the very genesis of all this, you have Kim Il-sung, who is the one who's actually willing to say, no, we don't need immediate independence now because the Soviets right now don't want it. So he was very pragmatic in aligning himself with what the Soviets wanted at that moment, and that effectively led to the downfall of Cho Man-sik. And you're right, it is a big what if. It's a big what could have been. And the other two figures that you mentioned as well, An Chang-ho and Yeo Eun-hyung, all three of these men are just remarkable figures, mostly forgotten. An Chang-ho perhaps less than the others, but out of the three of them, they're little remembered even in Korea today. And I think it's a real pity because they are incredible, dynamic, fully fleshed out human beings. They were complex, and you couldn't pigeonhole them necessarily, but they were, if any of them had ended up leading Korea, it would be very different. It would be a very different picture today.
It would be, but for the assassinations and everything that took place. I mean, you read the stories of these people and then you come to the end, which often was with a bullet, or you describe it as a disappearance. I fear most people many Koreanists will probably be aware of the fact that Kim Il-sung was not his real name. But you describe, and this is just going back to sort of the revelation, the shamanist things, because I recently read Fyodor Tatitsky's excellent book on Kim Il-sung, but you talk about this idea that Kim Il-sung was sort of this 8-foot tall. There was language about Kim Il-sung that I'd not really seen elsewhere, that, it wasn't just a guerrilla fighter, someone in the hills of Manchuria, but there was kind of a legend around this. So Kim Song-ju, Kim Han-byol, also you reference in the book, Can you just say something about how this man that grew up third generation Christian, going to church, then suddenly sort of changed his name and became something else, morphed into legend, as it were?
Yeah, in his own memoir, he tells that story of how he got the name Kim Il-sung. He basically claims that it was his friends, his supporters, who all say, "You're such a great man. We should call you the one star, or becoming the sun, or becoming the star." I mean, he has Han-byol, Il-sung, all these different sort of names. But of course, what is undeniable is that there was a legend of a Kim Il-sung. Now, some of the other scholars that have been doing this for a long time, Seo Dae-suk most notably, have pointed out that there were dozens of so-called Kim Il-sungs out there. And so actually with the Jeonggamnok that we talked about earlier, same thing. There wasn't one version. There were many different versions of these, and a lot of them spread by word of mouth. There wasn't like one authoritative version until Kim Song-ju claims that name. And now, of course, Kim Il-sung is synonymous with the man who was born, Kim Song-ju. But there may have been Kim Il-sungs before who did have some level of achievement and attainment and did pull off some feats in fighting the Japanese in Manchuria and elsewhere. But he was very savvy. And it comes back to this myth-making that we talked about earlier. Kim Il-sung proved and showed how adept he was at adopting these different persona and making them his own. And that's part of the genius of Kim Il-sung and how he got to where he did in 1945 as a 33-year-old, but also how he was able to hold on to power for 49 years and how he was able to then transfer power to his son and then, of course, later to his grandson. And all of that is a big part of the North Korea story. And I think that is something that is underappreciated. I mean, obviously, no one is going to say that the personality cult in North Korea is underappreciated. Everybody knows that it's quite a formidable one. I would argue the greatest in human history. But we focus a lot, of course, in the news cycle about the nukes and about the military aspects of the rule. We talk about the repression, we talk about the surveillance, and all of those are definitely a part of the toolkit. That's part of the reason why North Korea, the DPRK, is still here in the year 2026, when many predicted it was not going to outlast the 1990s. But I think what I'm trying to show here is that the ideological component of it, the beliefs that they were able to imbue in their 25 million people, is actually perhaps the strongest thing that they have going for them. That is the key element in the toolkit. in many ways. And it goes right back to the beginning of Kim Il-sung's own life and his own upbringing and his own mythology.
It's a theocracy almost. That's one of the ways that I try to get my students, international students at least, to understand North Korea, in that, yes, they have politicians and departments of education and finance and transport and all of this. They're human beings with toothaches and dreams and all of this. But at the same time, it's they're not living in a political system almost. They are, but it's almost like a religious system, just with different stories that we might be used to. I'm going to confess now that this is the moment in your book that I've got up to reading, because it's quite a big book and I'm about 400 pages in. So this will perhaps be my sort of final question, unless you have anything to say. But this is about South Korea, because with the division of the peninsula, with the trusteeship, that meant that a lot of the Christians in the northern half of the peninsula, they feared this repression. And so eventually they realized compromise would be very difficult. There were land reforms you write about. And so they ran south, and you get this sort of mass exodus there. You talk about Lee Seung-man, the first president, sort of making Christmas become a national holiday, nothing happening on Sundays, despite only 1% of the population being Protestant at the time. Can you say something perhaps just about how Christianity then moved from Pyongyang to the south and how it's playing out here, please?
Sure, yeah, it's a great question. And you're absolutely right. I mean, most people, especially if you're not a Koreanist, but you do know something about South Korea, you will think about the Christian element of it. That is something that is quite visible and quite prominent. Some of the biggest megachurches in the world today are in South Korea. South Korea is the largest sender of foreign missionaries in the world, other than the US, which of course has 7 times the number of people in total as South Korea does. And you have a lot of what you would call these new spiritual movements, you could call them, that are somewhat Christian in their roots, right? I mean, the Unification Church would be a very high-profile example, but you had Shincheonji, which we learned about a lot more during the COVID pandemic. You also had, Park Geun-hye and her, shamaness sort of Choi Sun-sil. I don't know what you want to call her, advisor, supporter, I don't know what, spiritual counselor or something. And her father, of course, was also, a Christian-ish pastor, let's put it that way. And so you have this all woven into South Korea today. But as you mentioned earlier, before the line was drawn across the 30th parallel, most of the Christians were in the north and most of the socialists were in the south, in Jeju, and in places that were just more receptive to communism. What's so interesting is that because that 30th parallel was not a hard, it's not like the demilitarized zone today. It was quite porous at first. And then, of course, the Korean War, the lines moved so much that people could get to the other side if they wanted to. So there was a big sort, you could say. There was a big partition, you could say, where people self-sorted and went to where they wanted to be. And when we think about the South Korean church today, what's interesting is that it has a lot of the elements of what was in the North Korean church, or let's call it the Northern Korean church, because there was no North Korea back then. But the conservative strain of Christianity that was really born in Pyongyang, but also in Uiju, up on the border with China. These two cities, you had a lot, and in between all these different points, there were all these stops along the train line that were all Christian as well in the Northwest. All of these Christian leaders, they all flowed south of the 30th parallel, except for Cho Man-sik, who refused to leave. And of course, he paid the price for that. But everyone who came south, they brought that. And they brought with them not only a conservatism, but they brought, as many scholars have written, they brought a sense of martyrdom with them, because they had left, they were in exile in a certain sense. They were in Babylon, they were in Seoul, and they were in Busan, and they were in these other places. And so they set up the big megachurches of Seoul. Not all of them, but many of them were set up by Northwestern Koreans. I mean, Jeonggamnok Presbyterian Church is one of the most famous ones, and that was started by Han Kyung-sik, who was from the Pyongyang area, but his church was in Uiju at the time of the division of the peninsula. He was a former student of Samuel Moffett, and he became perhaps the most prominent anti-communist Christian pastor in post-war South Korea. But really, he was bringing the worldview and the teachings and the ideas of Northwestern Korea to Seoul. And so what we now think of as South Korean Christianity, it's hard to separate out what is South Korean Christianity without North Korean Christianity. It's actually, in many ways, one and the same. And you're right, too, to point out that only 1% of the South Korean population at that time was self-identified as Christian, and yet it tended to be the most important people and the people who were most prominent. And so there was a sense that they were overrepresented in power and politics simply because so many of them had embraced Christianity. And so that image that we have of South Korea is not inaccurate, but there is, of course, more nuance to it than what most people would ordinarily think.
This is a very light-hearted question, but you have a good knowledge of East Asia and an experience, Jonathan. Does Korea, the Korean peninsula, have something with cults and spirituality? Saibi in the modern vernacular. Japan has just told the Unification Church no more. China has its own. Is it just different political systems operating? How does China or Japanese people look at Korea? And I'm trying to ask you about cults and spirituality. Is there something here, or does that just manifest everywhere around the world?
I think we have to be cautious, first of all. There are cults in every country around the world. And cults, first of all, even that word cult, we need to unpack because it is obviously a very loaded term. It's 1/3 of the phrase cult of personality, but a cult of personality, I think, is a more stable and less controversial sort of idea. I think we know one when we see one to a degree. Certainly we can all agree on the big ones. I mean, there's no question about that. But what is a cult? A cult in many ways, of course, is just a pejorative term for any sort of spiritual belief that the person who's using that word doesn't believe in. And so no one would ever say, I'm a member of a cult. They would say, I'm a member of a movement. I'm a member of a religion. I'm a member of a church. I'm a member of this and that, or I'm a follower of so-and-so. No one would say, oh, I'm a cult member. Not until after they leave might they then say, oh, yes, I was a cult member. So let me just start with that. And I don't want to dodge the question, but because there definitely is something there, and it's not just the Chinese and the Japanese who will say it. Many Koreans will say it as well, and you could look at it in a negative way, but I don't think it necessarily needs to be looked at in a negative way. But you can kind of say that the Koreans, in many ways, have taken a lot of imported ideas and sort of taken them to their logical conclusion, or taken them even further. And so you'll hear people say this, and I've encountered this. I think it's more just a thing people say rather than it is. I don't think there's one person associated with this quote, not that I've seen, but this idea that the Koreans took something like Confucianism, an import from China, and took it much further than the Chinese did. And, enshrined it, even though Mao came along and got rid of Confucianism and everything else, many people would say that South Korea is more of a Confucian society in many ways than China is today. You could say that they took capitalism, another, if you want to call it an import, and they took that, and it's a hyper-capitalist society. They took something like Stalinism, socialism, and in North Korea, they sort of took it to another extreme. And with Christianity, you could say the same thing as well. They took it, and within a few years, it's amazing. You see all these Western church leaders come over from America, and they say, I did not expect to come to Korea, to sail across the world, to come to this place that's only had Christianity and Christian missionaries for 20 years and have my faith challenged. For me to come here and look at the way the Koreans, how fervent they are, and to say, I thought I was committed to my faith, and now you've put me to shame. I realize I'm just a beginner. The way these people pray, the way they worship, the way they read their Bibles, the way they memorize their Bibles, the way they give money to the church, it puts me to shame. So this is what I mean. You sort of take things, and perhaps there is something in the Korean DNA. I don't want to, I'm not Korean. I don't want to venture there necessarily, but there's no question that Korea is this kingdom that has survived as its own kingdom at the edge of this big landmass that otherwise mostly got subsumed in history through different Chinese dynasties, managed to stay separate and distinct. And there was something that was different there. And I don't know if that's the answer, but to me, it rings true to a large degree. And that's not proof of anything, but it's certainly how I think about it.
I love that you didn't dodge the question. I appreciate that. And I thank you for it as well, because it would be easy just to brush it off. But you mentioned these things about taking things to their logical conclusions or imitation and then reinterpretation that they do. They become more Confucian than the Chinese, more Stalinist than the Stalins. I'll add one more string to that bow that you just created, Jonathan, which is they took the pop music of New Kids on the Block and Spice Girls and Backstreet Boys and NSYNC, and they just dialed that up to something that, you know, it has become a global phenomenon, not just in one or two groups, but it's an industry, a genre, a cultural product of K-pop, and it's just extending that Western boy-girl group idea into something that few could conceive, isn't it? And it's
exactly.
Yeah.
No, it's actually a great example. I mean, they almost broke it down, scientifically analyzed it in this case, and then found a way to just maximize all attributes, right? And it's incredible.
Yeah. Perhaps during this, towards the close, because I'm so grateful for your time, Jonathan, takeaways from this book, or what you want people to know, because I told you personally that this book surprised me so heavily. And so is there anything that we've missed from the book that you would like to get across? Is there anything you would like to say to people about the book, or give us that, please, Jonathan?
Yeah, I think it would be that in this day and age, in many ways, in the big cities of the world, it feels in many ways that we're in a post-religious sort of a society. I say that with an asterisk because it is true that you do see religiosity starting to rise again in young people. And you see that in America, you see that in Europe, you see that in unexpected places, certainly in the global south, in Latin America, in Africa. And yet, for many in the educated, polite sort of elite, there's a sense that religion is this quaint thing that we used to believe when we were cavemen, or when we, didn't know about gravity and we didn't know that the earth revolved around the sun. But now we know better now. We're past it, and that's sort of the promise of socialism, the opiate of the masses. Religion is not a thing that is going to be with us in the future. It's a vestige of our animalistic primordial past. But I think what Kim Il-sung really shows and really captured and really understood is that faith is really important. It's really central, whether or not you call yourself a Christian or a Buddhist or a Muslim or whatever, or an atheist or an agnostic. You believe something, whether you acknowledge it or not, and whether you can articulate it or not. And to me, I think faith is the most powerful thing in many ways, because we know, all of us know, that fame and sex and power and money can motivate people and lead people to do incredible things, whether they're incredibly good or incredibly bad. These are real motivators, but faith taps into something even deeper. It subsumes all of them in a certain sense, because it almost talks about life after death. It talks about things that are bigger than, it talks about transcendence. And I think Kim Il-sung recognized that if you're able to understand and tap into those beliefs that people have, and if you're able to create something that they can believe in, you can make people do almost anything. And you see that in cult movements around the world until the spell breaks. The difference is that North Korea, and I would not necessarily call it a cult, but I would call it a religious society, because I do think it's a society that is oriented around effectively the worship of the Kim family, in ritual and in word and in deed. And so he was able to create something that I think is just, when we look at North Korea, many people will look at it and ridicule it, and look at the Kims and look at their fashion and look at the ridiculousness of the cult. But there's a lot of seriousness there. And there's a reason why it's the DPRK that's still standing in 2026, arguably stronger than almost any other country of its peers. You look at Cuba, you look at the USSR, you look at East Germany, you look at Vietnam, you look at China even. I mean, I'm not going to say DPRK is stronger than China, but certainly China's changed quite a bit since the Cultural Revolution years, for example. But the DPRK and Kim Il-sung found something enduring here. And in a way, he found his own immortality. And I don't want to say that that's necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, but we're still talking about him. His statues still stand. He is still the eternal president. His country, his family is still leading this nation of 25 million people. And it all comes back, I think, to an understanding of the power of faith. And I don't think anyone understood it perhaps better than Kim Il-sung did. And I think that's why we are where we are, why the Korean Peninsula is the way that it is today. He's the most consequential figure in 20th century Korean history. And I don't know that enough has been done to understand not only him, but his Christian upbringing and how that flowed into the nation state that we see today.
It's very thought-provoking, what you say, Jonathan, the idea, because it raises all sorts of questions about how will he be remembered in the future, once we come out of the warp and woof of modern society with all our ideas, when people in the future look back and they don't have the contemporary sources that we do, and they might just have his autobiographies, his volumes, remnants of statues or things like this. How will they look back on him? Yeah, it's wonderful. Have you read, this is a strange question, just as I ask you for some recommendations before we close, have you read Eric Hoffer's The True Believer?
I have.
Yeah,
I have. And I cite it. I cite it in the book because it's not about North Korea, of course. It was written, I believe, in 1951, but he would have understood Kim Il-sung quite well. And I'm glad you raised that. I mean, there were a couple other books that were like that tap into some of the ideas that I try to hint at. But ultimately, the book I'm writing here is a work of narrative history. It's not a book of theory. It's certainly not a policy book. Most of it takes place before 1994. Almost all of it takes place before 1994. It's a book of history, and I hope it's a readable one. It's long, as you say, but I hope it's readable. But underpinning that is ideas like the True Believer, and there you go. I'm glad you asked about that.
Good. It is incredibly readable. Ladies and gentlemen, if you are listening, I'll ask you for a couple of recommendations and then we're done, Jonathan. They can be about anything: books, movies, podcasts, albums. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to Korea Deconstructed. I appreciate your eyes, your ears, however you can support this. Please do, when you get the chance, check out Jonathan Cheng's book, Korean Messiah, Kim Il-sung and the Christian Roots of North Korea's Personality Cult, because I'm a Koreanist and I do a lot of work on Korea, but I not only had a wonderful time reading this book, but I learned from this book. And I think that's what we want when we pick something up. We not only want to learn, but we want to read something and be taken on a journey. So do please read it. Jonathan, final recommendations. Give us a couple of things, please.
Oh, okay. Well, I will start with Korea because that's the audience, and I'm obsessed with Korea. I always recommend these two works by Richard E. Kim. So he was a novelist, a Korean-American novelist. He was also, raised in a Presbyterian family. And he wrote his first real breakthrough novel was called The Martyred. And it was set during the Korean War. It's a work of fiction. And it's about these pastors who are, sort of executed by the communists during the Korean War, but it talks a lot about guilt and about belief and salvation and sin and all this other stuff, but it's so beautifully written and gets at all of these big existential sort of questions, but does it in a way that doesn't feel too heavy-handed. I do love that one, but I love perhaps even more Lost Names, which was a collection of short stories that he wrote, which was basically, he calls it scenes from a Korean boyhood, I believe, if I'm recalling it correctly. And he's done interviews where he basically makes it clear that it is autobiographical. Sometimes these can get kind of fuzzy. How much is it fiction and how much of it is autobiography? But you asked that question earlier about that feeling of anti-Japanese sentiment that propelled Korean nationalism. And I think you really get a ground level sort of view of how that looked and how that felt when you read Lost Names. And Lost Names, the title, is a reference to the Japanese coercion of Koreans into giving up their names and adopting Korean ones. Mm. I really don't think I understood the depth of feeling not being Korean myself, not being alive during the Japanese colonial period, it really brought it alive for me. So I'd recommend those two on the Korea front. Maybe relatedly, but not tied to Korea directly. I think, when we talk about religious societies, I think there's one that stands above all the rest in so many ways, and that's Jonestown. And Jonestown does come up in my book because the Reverend Jim Jones was from Indiana, same state as Samuel Moffett, and did have great admiration for Kim Il-sung. He adopted Korean children, and he praised him in his sermons at Jonestown. And Jonestown, actually, it's interesting. When I raised Jonestown with people, many people no longer know about Jonestown. Of course, it happened in the late 1970s, but it was quite traumatic. If you've never heard of Jonestown, you just Google Jonestown and you can go down rabbit holes. But the one I liked the most is perhaps the most accessible. It was written just 15 years ago by a woman named Julia Shears. It's called 1,000 Lives, and it just is a story about Jonestown and how Jonestown came to be. And I think I was really inspired by a few of the things that she did in her book. She wrote about the one thing that really stood out to me, and it comes back to this word cult, is that nobody joins a cult. Nobody knowingly joins the cult, and nobody is above joining a cult, as it were. Everyone would like to think, oh, I would never have fallen for that. And yet you see the people who do join these religious societies, and many of them are very intelligent and are very savvy and so on. But there is something in the human spirit that needs something that many of these religious societies offer. In other words, there is, to use a very Christian term, there is a God-shaped hole in all of us. There is something that we in our Homo sapiens DNA just almost kind of need to have in us, whether or not we acknowledge it or not. And the ones who are able to tap it, like Jim Jones, to devastating effect, can really capture it. And so I just recommend that book because it's an alternative look. It has nothing to do with North Korea, although there was a Jonestown, North Korea connection, which does come up in my book. So I do that for books. Do you want more or like other things, or are we good?
Give us one more.
One more.
Something to watch, something to listen to.
Okay, well, I mean, if I have to give a shout out to something to listen to, I mean, I really have one love that I have to share, and that's Bruce Springsteen. I've always been a big fan of his. I went to Princeton in New Jersey. He was a New Jersey guy, and I just couldn't understand his music when I first listened to it, because he's treated almost like a deity in New Jersey. He's the patron saint of New Jersey, but his music was so synth-driven and so strange, with saxophones and guitars and things that growing up in the 90s, it just didn't make any sense to me that this was popular at any time. It just seemed so lame. And I picked up a greatest hits when I was in college, and I listened to it, and I said, what on earth is this? How do people like this? And I gave it another listen, and I gave it a third listen. And after the third listen, something started to click. And it's the lyrics, it's the music, it's everything. But what I love about him is he is able to capture just a lot of the same themes that I'm talking about here. He talks a lot about faith. He talks a lot about belief. He talks a lot about a nation and why we do the things that we do. He talks a lot about action and consequence. And he has a lot of story songs. He's got a foot in country music, and actions have reactions and consequences, and he wrestles with them and deals with them in a way that I've always found really helpful. It's music for the heart. It's music for the brain, and I really love it. And Tunnel of Love, 1987, probably one of his top masterworks. I've been listening to that a lot lately. So there you go. That's my recommendation. Everyone should listen to it and give him a chance. Get past the synths and the saxophones. He's one of a kind.
I don't think there will be many conversations out there that feature Kim Il-sung and Bruce Springsteen. But Jonathan, this is now one of them. I'll go for a run later this afternoon and I'll put Tunnel of Love on, and I'll get past the synth and the saxophones for you. Thank you very much, Jonathan. This was a wonderful conversation.
Thanks for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Excellent.